Hey, good morning, y'all. Miss you. Hope everyone is doing well, given the circumstances. Really sad this morning that we can't be together for some reason. It's really hitting right now. But glad we can at least, yeah, study in some way. So I got the fire going for old time's sake. Um, so anyway, you're loved, you're missed. Let's jump into chapter 3. So he gets the ghost and C.S. Lewis, who's traveling with them. They leave the gray town. And in chapter 3, they finally arrive in the high countries. And there's some things I want to point out about this depiction of the high countries. And I'm not going to say heaven yet, but I do want you to thinking of like a heaven state. And I'll explain why I won't say heaven. But some things you should have noticed, and you should be adding to your heaven and hell chart in your book or in your notes wherever you have it, is that in the high countries, it's this morning twilight. So remember, I said to pay attention to the light. Anything that talks about light is going to be important in this book. And specifically in this chapter, in the high countries, it's this morning twilight. So it's that period right before the sun rises, where the dew is on the grass. If you ever go for like morning runs, this is the perfect time to do it. It's cool, but it's not cold. You know that any moment the sunrise is going to come out. It's actually just like this. I don't know, you can't really see it, but it's that gray period. It's that gray period, but it's a hopeful gray. It's a hopeful sort of in between. And the high countries are in this perpetual morning twilight. And he says this in chapter 3. He says, the light and the coolness that drenched me were like those of a summer morning, early morning, a minute or two before sunrise. So it's a beautiful time of day. It's one of my favorite times of day. I'm a morning person. I love this period. And the high countries are in that perpetual twilight. He talks about it as a larger sort of space. This is interesting. He says, it gave me a feeling of freedom, but also of exposure and possibly of danger. So it's interesting. They step off this bus, and you'll notice all the ghosts huddle close to the bus, right? They don't run out and frolic in the fields. And we don't fully understand why yet, but it's almost like he's in this more real reality. Okay, it's almost like everything is just more real. And it reminds me of that quote from Narnia where we talked about the things worth clinging to, like Aslan, are good but not safe, right? He's good, but he's not safe. And it seems to be that Lewis is again doing this with the Great Divorce with the High Countries. It's good, it's a feeling of freedom, but it's also this feeling of exposure. It's like all of a sudden, if we could flip our insides out and we realize that could see everything going on in our heads and our hearts and our spirits, right? Which is true, but we don't often think that way. It'd be this feeling of exposure. There'd be some fear. And C.S. Lewis experiences that in this larger sort of space. And then he also says that everything is solid. Okay, so in the gray town, everything was unsubstantial and ghost-like, right? You could think a house and you'd have a house. But it didn't keep the rain out. And here, everything is so much more solid. And so the ghosts get out of the bus, and the grass hurts their feet. And Lewis, observing this, says, I noticed that the grass did not bend under their feet. Even the dewdrops were not disturbed. And he, too, is a ghost, as he tries to pick up a leaf and he can't, or he tries to pluck a blade of grass and he can't do it. And he's entered into this ultimate reality, essentially, that everything that he thought was real and that they all thought was real in the gray town turns out to be ghost-like and transparent compared to this reality in the high countries. So here's some things I want us to highlight with the gray town and the high countries. You should have most of these things on your charts, but these are things I want us to really focus on. In the gray town, you'll notice it's twilight, but it's a twilight before night. So it's that time, 5, 6 o'clock, maybe 7 or 8 in the summer, where the sun has set, but it's still light. And it only lasts about 15 minutes, and then it just gets dark suddenly. And it's really interesting in chapter 2, the ghosts are afraid of it. They're afraid of when it will become night. And if you go to page 14, second paragraph on page 14, last sentence, the tussle-headed poet says, talking about why don't people live together. And the Tussle-headed poet saying, I think they should live together. And he says, anyway, here he dropped his voice. It'd be better, everyone admits that. Safety in numbers. And C.S. Lewis says, safety from what? I began, but my companion nudged me to be silent. I changed my question. Right? So they're afraid of something. And then if we go to page 15, second sentence from the page, the ghost says, it will be dark presently, he mouthed. You mean the evening really is going to turn into a night in the end? He nodded. Okay, so they're in this twilight that seems like it's going to last forever, but there's this fear that it will eventually become night. In the high countries, it's also in a twilight, but this is a twilight before morning. So it's also that period where it's gray and there's light, but this is a hopeful version of it. The promise or the threat of sunrise rested immovably up there. So they're both in this in-between stage, one before night, one before morning. In the gray town, everything is unsubstantial and ghost-like. You can think a house and you have a house. There's a picture of Napoleon, right, in hell, in his huge mansion that he can just think up. And then you get in an argument and you move to another place. And C.S. Lewis says, well, how can they do it so easily? And the ghost says, oh, it's easy. You just think a house and you got a house. Think a mansion. But it doesn't even keep out the rain. It's ghost-like. It's not real. It's unlimited things, right? In hell, unlimited things. But they don't last. They're not solid. In the high countries, everything is solid, is tangible, is more real in a sense. And so we get that comparison. One's a twilight before night, one's a twilight before morning. One is unsubstantial, nothing really lasts, even though you have unlimited amounts of it. In the high countries, there's limited amounts, but everything is solid and real. In the gray town, everything is constantly moving apart. People are getting in arguments. Everything is just spreading thinner and thinner and thinner. Everyone's moving away from their neighbors. Here, you have a larger sort of space. It's big, but everything is whole and compact. And that's hard to depict how it could be that big and compact at the same time. But everything is just real and together. Again, it's this ultimate reality. And so here's the claim I want to make. And this is the main focus of the book. And this is where I want you to really hone in. And we're going to draw a diagram together. My claim is that The Great Divorce, is not a story of heaven and hell, but a story of earth. Okay? I don't think if we could have C.S. Lewis, I could pull him up in a chair right next to me and say, hey, was this story about, do you actually think that you can get on a bus from hell and go to heaven and choose to stay there? I think he'd be like, no, you're crazy. No, I don't think that, right? I think Lewis here is getting at, he's depicting us. He's depicting our choice. And I'll explain that here. And this is the diagram that I want you guys, I have mine in the front cover of my book. So we're going to build this diagram together. You should be writing this in your notes. And I'm going to explain why I don't think this is actually a story about heaven and hell and about choosing, but a story about earth. So we're going to start with and this is where you guys should be building the diagram in the front cover. You have the gray town, you have the high countries, okay, which we kind of just talked about. In the gray town and in the high countries, it's twilight. All right, it's a gray in-between period. Where the sun has not risen or has not set, but it's still gray and there's enough light to see by. However, in the gray town, we know that this twilight is eventually fading to night, and the ghosts are terrified of it. Right? The ghosts are terrified of it, but some of them even say, and if you look back in chapter 2, some of them don't believe it's ever going to turn into night. Right? They're like, oh, it'll never change. It's always like this. But some of them deep down, they know. Right? So it's fading into this deep night, and you'll see I put next to that, I wrote hell. Right? This is the eternal darkness. So the gray town's in this in-between period that will eventually, even though not everyone believes it, fade into this eternal night. In the high countries, it's also in a twilight, but it's in a twilight that's going to fade into day. Right? So this is the twilight right before morning instead of the twilight right before night. This is the twilight that is eventually, it's the in-between period, again, just like it is in the gray town. but it's an in-between period that one day is going to be day. And that's why I put heaven. It's going to be eternal light, eternal day. And so the question I want us to think about is, where do we see in our lives an in-between period before eternal night and day? Where do we see a twilight period before eternal night and day? And the answer should be relatively obvious. We see it on earth. This is life in the mist. This is what we've talked about, where we get glimpses of things, but we don't know the full reality yet because we're living in this gray period. We're living in this twilight. It's a twilight that will eventually become, for those who are believers, ultimate day. And it's a twilight that will eventually become, for those that are lost, ultimate night. But currently, we all share this twilight together, right? We're all living in this mist. The difference, though, is that the people in the gray town are ghosts, right? They're unsubstantial. The people in the high countries also living in a twilight, but they're solid. And the choice, I think, that Lewis wants us to see is, which twilight are we going to live in, right? The choice is, are we going to choose to live in a twilight that will fade to night? Are we going to choose to be ghosts? Or are we going to choose to live in a twilight that will eventually fade to morning? But the thing I want you to see is, again, I don't think Lewis actually thinks that you can go from heaven to hell and vice versa. I don't even think this is about purgatory in that sense. I think this is about earth and our lives now. That now we are making the decision of, do we want to live in a twilight that fades to morning? Do we want to be solid, or do we want to live in a twilight that fades to night? And currently we're all together, right? That's why I think it's so interesting walking up and down the halls of CCS. I think some of us are solid, right? I think some of you as students are solid, meaning that you're living in a twilight. Currently, you're living in an in-between period that will one day become dead, will one day become ultimate heaven. I think some of y'all are living in, y'all meaning just students at CCS, are ghosts. Some of you that haven't truly embraced the gospel maybe, right, are maybe living in a twilight. You're living in an in-between period, just like the rest of us, but you're living in a twilight that is fading to night. And so when I talked about the choice, here's, I think, what our choice is. We have the choice of which twilight do we want to live in. Do we want to be ghosts, or do we want to be solid? We're all living in a twilight, but do we want to live in a twilight in the gray countries that's going to fade to night, or a twilight in the high countries that will one day fade into day? And in chapter 3, one of the ghosts says, well, when's the bus go back? And the driver has this great quote that I think should drive the way we read, no pun intended, the rest of the text, which is, the driver says, you need never come back unless you want to. Right? We are given the choice. All of the ghosts on the bus are given the choice. Do they want to stay? Because they can stay. It's their choice. Do they want to go back? Because they can go back. It's their choice. Which twilight will we live in? So that's what I mean when I say I don't think that this is about heaven and hell. I think this is about us. It's about us making the decision now of whether we want to live in an in-between period that will fade into day, or an in-between period that will fade into night. And that's where this great quote, it's all about a shift in perspective. And I think this happens in chapter 3. C.S. Lewis says, it's on page 21. His character says, then some readjustment of the mind, or some focusing of the eyes took place, and I saw the whole phenomenon the other way around. The men were as they had always been, as all the men I had known had been, perhaps. So like all of us. It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different. So we are, in a sense, for those that are not saved, we are the ghosts. Okay? We are the ghosts. And so it's not that they're in hell so much as just that they are in a twilight that is not yet day. So anyway, here's the picture of our board. You'll see this is called Life in the Twilight. Very similar to Life in the Mist, right? You'll notice, hopefully you're noticing that a lot of these books share the same themes, which is that we see glimpses right now, but one day we will see in full. And so as we continue to read, what I want you guys to continue referencing back to is this chart. Why would a character ever choose to go back to the gray town? Well, we'll see. You have unlimited things, even though they don't last, but they're unlimited. And you also see why some of the ghosts choose to stay in the high countries. And that's the choice that we're all given. Do we want to stay in the high countries, or do we want to go back to the gray town? Which twilight will we live in? All right, so that should be our focus as we continue reading this.